The Austin Convention Center was packed with political heavyweights for the Texas Legislative Summit when everything changed in an instant. Governor Greg Abbott sat confidently at the panel table, his signature smirk plastered across his face as he prepared to defend his controversial new laws. But nobody expected what happened next. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat, microphone in hand, and delivered a question so devastating that Abbott's face went completely blank. The room fell dead silent. Camera phones shot up everywhere. What she said next didn't just challenge Abbott. It exposed him in front of the entire Texas political establishment. This wasn't just another political disagreement. This was a moment a rising Democratic star took down the most powerful Republican in Texas, and his reaction said everything you needed to know about who really won. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, hit that like button if you're ready to see Abbott get completely dismantled, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these incredible political moments. To understand why this moment was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two political powerhouses are and why this confrontation mattered so much. At 66, Greg Abbott has been Texas governor since 2015, building his reputation as one of the most conservative governors in America. He's the man behind some of the most controversial laws in recent memory: the 6-week abortion ban, the voting restrictions that Democrats call voter suppression, and the border policies that have sparked national outrage. Abbott doesn't back down from fights. He's taken on the Biden administration, sued the federal government over 100 times, and never hesitated to use his power to push through his agenda. His supporters see him as a fearless conservative warrior. His critics call him an authoritarian who tramples on people's rights. But there's something else about Abbott that makes him particularly confident in debates. He's used to winning them. For years, he's dominated Texas politics, crushing Democratic opponents and silencing critics with his sharp legal mind and political experience. At just 42, Jasmine Crockett represents everything Abbott and the Texas Republican establishment fear about the changing face of American politics. A civil rights attorney turned congresswoman from Dallas, she's become one of the most powerful voices for progressive politics in Texas. Crockett didn't come from political royalty. She grew up in St. Louis, worked her way through law school, and spent years fighting for justice in the courtroom before ever thinking about running for office. But when she got to Congress in 2023, she immediately made waves. She's the woman who went viral for destroying Marjorie Taylor Greene in a congressional hearing, calling out her bleach blonde bad-built butch body in a moment that had the internet going crazy. She's fearless, she's sharp, and she doesn't back down from anyone, not even powerful white men who think they can intimidate her. This wasn't just about two politicians arguing. This was about the soul of Texas itself. Abbott has spent years pushing through laws that Democrats say target women, minorities, and voting rights. His abortion ban has forced women to travel out of state for health care. His voting laws have made it harder for people in minority communities to cast their ballots. His border policies have separated families and created chaos at the southern border. For Crockett, this was bigger than politics. It was personal. She represents a communities most affected by Abbott's policies. Her constituents are the women who can't get the health care they need, the voters who face longer lines and more restrictions, the families torn apart by harsh immigration enforcement. But for Abbott, this summit was supposed to be a victory lap. Surrounded by Republican allies, speaking to a friendly crowd, defending laws that his base loves, he expected easy questions and softball treatment. He had no idea what was coming. The tension in that Austin Convention Center was electric. On one side sat the most powerful Republican in Texas, backed by years of political victories and a machine that had crushed Democratic opposition for decades. On the other side stood a black woman from Dallas who had never been afraid to speak truth to power, no matter the consequences. What happened next would change how people see both of them forever. The Texas Legislative Summit was supposed to be Greg Abbott's moment to shine. The Austin Convention Center was filled with state legislators, political operatives, and media from across Texas. Abbott sat at the center of a panel discussing Texas leadership in conservative governance, flanked by Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and several Republican state senators. For the first hour, everything went exactly as Abbott expected. Friendly questions from conservative moderators, softball inquiries about his success stories, and plenty of opportunities to bash Democrats and the Biden administration. Abbott was in his element, that confident smirk never leaving his face as he rattled off statistics about Texas job growth and border security. Governor Abbott, said the moderator, a well-known conservative radio host. Your administration has passed some of the most significant conservative legislation in the country. How do you respond to critics who say these laws go too far? Abbott leaned into his microphone, clearly relishing the question. Well, Jim, the beauty of our constitutional system is that states like Texas can lead when Washington fails. We protected life with our heartbeat bill, secured our elections with common-sense voter integrity measures, and defended our border when the federal government abandoned its responsibilities. Applause rippled through the crowd. Abbott supporters were eating it up. The radical left doesn't like it when we actually govern according to conservative principles. Abbott continued, his voice gaining strength. But the people of Texas elected us to do exactly what we're doing. We're not going to apologize for protecting Texas families and Texas values. More applause, louder this time. Abbott looked out over the crowd with satisfaction, his eyes scanning the friendly faces nodding in agreement. But then something shifted in the room. From the middle of the audience, a hand shot up. The moderator hadn't called for questions from the floor yet, but the woman standing up wasn't waiting for permission. Congresswoman Crockett, the moderator said, clearly surprised, I didn't realize you were in attendance today. Jasmine Crockett stood tall in her navy blue blazer, her voice carrying clearly across the room without a microphone. I was invited to observe, but I think the people of Texas deserve to hear some real questions about these so-called Texas values. A murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't on the program. Abbott's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair with the air of someone who had handled hostile questioners before. Of course, Congresswoman, Abbott said smoothly, I'm always happy to educate my colleagues across the aisle about our successful policies. The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Several Republicans in the audience chuckled. Abbott was playing to his crowd, treating Crockett like a naive child who didn't understand the complexities of governing. Crockett moved closer to the stage, and suddenly a volunteer handed her a microphone. Her voice now filled the room with crystal clarity. Governor Abbott, you just talk about protecting Texas families. Can you explain to me how forcing a 10-year-old rape victim to carry a pregnancy to term protects Texas families? The room went dead silent. Abbott's smirk disappeared instantly, replaced by a tight-lipped expression. He hadn't expected such a direct, brutal question right out of the gate. Congresswoman, that's a mischaracterization of our law, Abbott replied, his voice more measured now. Our heartbeat bill includes exceptions for the life of the mother, and— No, sir, it doesn't, Crockett interrupted, her voice rising. Your law has no exception for rape or incest. None. So I'll ask again, how does forcing a child to give birth after being raped protect Texas families? The tension in the room ratcheted up instantly. Several Republicans shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was not the friendly discussion they had signed up for. Abbott's face was starting to redden slightly. Our law protects the most vulnerable among us, the unborn. Every life has value, and including the life of that 10-year-old girl. Crockett shot back, or do only some lives matter in your Texas? Abbott was clearly rattled now. His usual confident demeanor was cracking under Crockett's relentless questioning. He looked to the moderator for help, but the man seemed frozen, unsure how to regain control of his own event. Governor, Crockett continued, not giving him a chance to recover, you also mentioned election integrity. Can you tell this room how many cases of voter fraud were prosecuted in Texas last year? Abbott straightened up, thinking he was back on safer ground. We prosecuted hundreds of cases of voter fraud. The actual number is 43, Crockett interrupted, her voice cutting through his response like a knife. 43 cases out of over 11 million votes cast. That's 0.0004%. So you pass laws that make it harder for CNAs, people with disabilities, and working families to vote, all to stop 43 cases of fraud. The math was devastating. Even some Republicans in the audience were doing the calculation in their heads, and their faces showed they didn't like what they found. Abbott was sweating now, visible beads forming on his forehead under the hot stage lights. Congresswoman, any amount of fraud is too much. But any amount of voter suppression is just fine. Crockett fired back. Your laws close polling locations in minority communities. They ban drive-through voting that help disabled voters. They made it a felony to help someone fill out a mail-in ballot. How is making it harder for legal voters to cast their ballots protecting democracy? Something remarkable was happening in that Austin Convention Center. What had started as Abbott's friendly crowd were beginning to shift. The absolute silence that had fallen over the room wasn't the respectful quiet of people listening to their governor anymore. It was the uncomfortable quiet of people watching someone get dismantled in real time. Several audience members were now recording on their phones, sensing they were witnessing something special. Others were leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed by the confrontation unfolding on stage. Abbott looked desperately to his fellow Republicans on the panel for support, but they were all studying their hands or staring straight ahead, clearly wanting no part of this demolition. "Governor," Crockett said, her voice now carrying the full authority of someone who had taken complete control of the room, "you mentioned border security. Your Operation Lone Star has cost Texas taxpayers over $10 billion so far. Can you tell us how many people that operation has actually prevented from crossing the border illegally?" Abbott's mouth opened, but no words came out. For a moment, he looked like a fish gasping for air. The question had hit him in an area where he claimed expertise, but clearly he didn't have the numbers to back up his claims. We've apprehended thousands of individuals. He finally managed to say. Apprehended and then turned over to federal authorities, Crockett clarified. The same federal authorities you claim aren't doing their job. So you're spending $10 billion to do what exactly? Hand people over to the feds you say are incompetent. The logic was unassailable, and Abbott knew it. His face was now fully red, and he was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. But Crockett wasn't done. Not even close. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media and talked about in Texas politics for years to come. Jasmine Crockett had already landed several devastating blows, but she was just getting warmed up. The knockout punch was still coming. Abbott tried to regain his composure, taking a sip of water and attempting to return to his talking points. Congresswoman, I think you're missing the bigger picture here. Texas leads the nation in job creation, economic growth. Governor Abbott, Crockett interrupted, her voice now carrying the tone of a prosecutor who had caught a witness in a lie. Since you want to talk about the bigger picture, let's talk about your record on the power grid. The color drained from Abbott's face. Everyone in Texas knew about the power grid failures during Winter Storm Uri in 2021. But Abbott had spent years trying to move past that disaster, claiming it was a once-in-a-lifetime event that couldn't have been predicted. Crockett wasn't about to let him off the hook. February 2021, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the now completely silent room. Temperatures drop below freezing across Texas. Your power grid fails. 246 people die. Millions lose power and heat for days. Do you remember what you told Texans then? Abbott shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That was an unprecedented weather event. You told us the grid was weatherized, Crockett continued, completely ignoring his attempt to deflect. You told us Texas was prepared. You told us this couldn't happen again. Is that correct? The grid has been improved since then. That's not what I asked you, Crockett shot back, her voice rising. I asked if you told Texans the grid was weatherized and prepared. Yes or no? Abbott looked trapped. He couldn't deny what he had said publicly, but admitting it would open him up to even more devastating follow-up questions. Yes, we believed the grid were prepared based on the information available at the time, he finally admitted. Crockett smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile of someone who had just gotten their opponent exactly where they wanted them. Governor, I have in my hand a report from the Public Utility Commission of Texas, she said, pulling out a thick document. This report was delivered to your office in November 2020, 3 months before Winter Storm Uri. Would you like me to read what it says about the Texas power grid's winter preparedness? Abbott's eyes went wide. He clearly had no idea this report existed, or if he did, he had hoped it would never surface publicly. I don't have that report in front of me, Abbott said weakly. Well, lucky for you, I do, Crockett replied, opening the document. And lucky for the people of Texas, this is a public record that anyone can access. She cleared her throat and began reading in a voice that carried to every corner of the convention center. The Texas power grid remains vulnerable to extreme winter weather events. Current winterization standards are insufficient to guarantee reliability during prolonged cold snaps. Immediate action is required to prevent catastrophic failures that could result in widespread blackouts and loss of life. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Abbott's face had gone from red to pale white, and his hands were visibly shaking. This report, Crockett continued, was sitting on your desk 3 months before 246 Texans died in the cold. 3 months, Governor. You had 3 months to act on these warnings, and you did nothing. Abbott tried to speak, but Crockett wasn't finished. She was like a skilled boxer who had hurt her opponent and was now moving in for the knockout. But here's the really interesting part, she said, flipping to another page in the report. This same report recommended specific winterization measures that would have cost approximately $8 billion to implement across the entire Texas grid. She looked up at Abbott, whose face was now a mask of pure panic. Governor, you spent $10 billion on Operation Lone Star, your border security theater that hasn't stopped anyone from crossing the border. But you couldn't find $8 billion to winterize the power grid and save 246 lives. The impact of that comparison hit the room like a physical blow. Even Abbott's Republican allies on the panel were staring at him in shock. The math was simple and devastating. Abbott had chosen to spend more money on political theater than on saving Texan lives. For a moment, Abbott said nothing. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. That report contained recommendations, not requirements. We had to prioritize. You had to prioritize. Crockett's voice exploded across the room. You prioritize border politics over keeping Texans alive? You prioritize your political career over children freezing to death in their homes. Abbott's composure completely cracked. Now, wait just a minute, he stammered, his voice rising in desperation. That's not fair. We couldn't have predicted. You had a report predicting exactly what happened. Crockett shouted back. You had 3 months to act. You had $10 billion to spend on the border, but not $8 billion to keep the lights on? What exactly were your priorities, Governor? What happened next was captured by dozens of phones and will be viewed millions of times within hours. Abbott, the man who had dominated Texas politics for nearly a decade, the conservative strongman who never backed down from a fight, simply sat there in stunned silence. His mouth hung slightly open. His eyes were wide and unfocused. For nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in politics, he said absolutely nothing. The most powerful man in Texas had been rendered completely speechless by a Congresswoman with a public document and some basic math. The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable even for Abbott supporters. Someone in the audience coughed. A chair creaked. But Abbott just sat there, his political career effectively ending in real time. When Crockett spoke again, her voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. Governor Abbott, 246 people died on your watch because you chose politics over preparation. Their families deserve better than your excuses. Texas deserves better than your failed leadership. And the American people deserve to know that when you had the choice between saving lives and scoring political points, you chose politics every single time. She paused, letting the words sink in. I have one final question for you, Governor. If you won't protect Texans from winter storms, if you won't protect children from rape, if you won't protect voters from suppression, if you won't protect women's health care, what exactly are you protecting? Abbott's response was devastating in its simplicity. Silence. Complete, total, absolute silence. The man who had built his political career on never backing down, never showing weakness, never letting Democrats get the better of him, had been reduced to sitting mute in front of cameras in a room full of political operatives. His face said everything. The shock, the humiliation, the realization that he had been completely outmaneuvered by someone he had clearly underestimated. This wasn't just a political defeat. It was a public destruction of everything Abbott had claimed to represent. The convention center had fallen into complete chaos. Republican operatives were frantically texting. Democratic staffers were trying not to smile too obviously. Reporters were furiously taking notes and checking their recording devices. But most telling of all were the faces of ordinary Texans in the audience. Many of them had supported Abbott, believed in his message, trusted his leadership. Now they were seeing him exposed as someone who had the information and resources to save lives but chose not to act. The moderator finally found his voice. I think we should take a break, he said weakly, but Crockett wasn't moving. She stood there, microphone still in hand, looking directly at Abbott with the calm confidence of someone who had just delivered a masterpiece of political destruction. Abbott finally stood up on shaky legs, his face still blank with shock. Without saying another word, he walked off the stage, leaving behind a room full of stunned observers and a political legacy in ruins. The knockout was complete. The most powerful Republican in Texas had been destroyed by a Congresswoman armed with nothing but the truth, some public documents, and the courage to speak for people who had died on Abbott's watch. The moment Greg Abbott walked off that stage in the Austin Convention Center, everything changed. What had just happened wasn't simply a heated political exchange. It was a seismic shift in Texas politics that would be felt for years to come. Within minutes, phones across the convention center were buzzing with notifications. The confrontation had been recorded by dozens of people, and the videos were already spreading across social media like wildfire. On Twitter, the hashtag #AbbottSpeechless started trending within 15 minutes. The video of Abbott sitting in stunned silence for 30 seconds, mouth agape, was being shared thousands of times per minute. But it wasn't just the silence that captivated viewers. It was his face. The look of a man who had been completely and utterly defeated, not by political spin or gotcha moments, but by simple, devastating facts. Watch. Greg Abbott rendered speechless when confronted with his own failures, read one viral tweet that garnered 50,000 retweets in the first hour. TikTok users were even faster, creating split-screen videos showing Abbott's confident opening remarks next to his shocked silence after Crockett's questions. The contrast was devastating and impossible to ignore. Democratic operatives across Texas and the country were in absolute euphoria. For years, they had watched Abbott dominate the political narrative, steamroll opponents, and implement increasingly extreme policies without facing serious consequences. Now, finally, someone had found a way to expose him that even his supporters couldn't ignore. Beto O'Rourke, who had lost to Abbott in the 2022 gubernatorial race, tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just did what I wish I could have done in 3 debates. She brought receipts, asked real questions, and showed Texas who Greg." Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez posted, "This is what it looks like when someone who actually represents the people confronts power with facts." At Jasmine for US just gave a masterclass in accountability. But perhaps most importantly, the response was coming from ordinary Texans who had lost loved ones during Winter Storm Uri. Maria Gonzalez, whose 73-year-old father had died of hypothermia during the blackouts, posted a video that quickly went viral. "My dad died because the power went out and we couldn't keep him warm. For 3 years, I've been told it was nobody's fault, that no one could have seen it coming. Today I learned that's a lie. Governor Abbott had a report 3 months before my dad died that warned this would happen. He chose not to act. How many of us have to die for his political games?" On the other side of the political aisle, panic was setting in. Republican operatives who had been planning to use the summit to launch Abbott's potential presidential campaign were now in full damage control mode. Text messages between GOP strategists, later leaked to the press, showed the depth of their concern. "This is a disaster. How did we not know about that report? We need to get him off stage. Now, can we kill the live stream? Too late. It's everywhere." Conservative media tried to spin the confrontation, with some claiming that Crockett had been grandstanding or that the report she cited was taken out of context. But the damage was too clear and too documented to explain away. Even Fox News, typically friendly to Abbott, was forced to cover the story. Their report was notably subdued, focusing more on Crockett's aggressive questioning than on Abbott's inability to answer. Within hours of the confrontation, Crockett's office released a full Public Utility Commission report she had cited. The document, which had been available to the public but largely ignored by media, painted an even more damning picture than Crockett had revealed in the convention center. The report didn't just warn about winter weather vulnerabilities. It provided specific, detailed recommendations that could have prevented the exact type of failures that occurred during Winter Storm Uri. It even included cost estimates and implementation timelines that showed the improvements could have been completed well before the February 2021 storm. Energy experts who reviewed the document confirmed its accuracy and importance. Dr. Michael Weber, a professor at the University of Texas who studies energy systems, told reporters, This report was a roadmap for preventing exactly what happened in 2021. The warnings were clear, specific, and actionable. The fact that these recommendations weren't implemented represents a catastrophic failure of leadership. For 24 hours after the confrontation, Abbott's office was silent. No statements, no explanations, no attempt to clarify his position. The silence only made the situation worse, as media outlets began digging deeper into the timeline of what Abbott knew and when he knew it. When Abbott finally did respond, it was through a written statement that many viewed as too little, too late. The winter storm of 2021 was an unprecedented event that challenged infrastructure across Texas. While we always take expert recommendations seriously, governing requires balancing multiple priorities and limited resources. We have since made significant improvements to grid reliability and will continue working to ensure Texas families are protected. The statement was immediately criticized as weak and evasive. It didn't address the specific report Crockett had cited, didn't explain why border security received more funding than grid improvements, and didn't acknowledge the lives lost during the storm. More damaging still, Abbott's attempt at damage control led to even more revelations. Investigative reporters, now energized by the story, began digging through other state records and found additional warnings about grid vulnerabilities that had been ignored. What made the aftermath particularly devastating for Abbott was how personal the story became. Families who had lost loved ones during Winter Storm Uri began speaking out, many for the first time. Jennifer Martinez, whose newborn baby had been hospitalized due to carbon monoxide poisoning when her family used a car to stay warm during the blackouts, said, "We almost lost our daughter because we were desperate to keep her from freezing. Now I find out Governor Abbott had warnings and chose to ignore them. How do you look at yourself in the mirror after that?" These weren't abstract political attacks. They were real people talking about real losses that could have been prevented if Abbott had acted on the information he had. Perhaps most significantly, the confrontation began to shift how voters viewed Abbott's political brand. For years, he had successfully positioned himself as a strong leader who protected Texas from outside threats. The revelation that he had failed to protect Texans from a documented internal threat undermined that entire narrative. Polling conducted in the weeks following the confrontation showed Abbott's approval rating dropping to its lowest point since taking office. More concerning for Republicans, the drop was particularly steep among suburban voters who had been moving away from the GOP but hadn't fully embraced Democrats. Sarah Chen, a voter from Plano who had supported Abbott in 2022, said, "I voted for him because I thought he was competent, even if I didn't agree with everything. But if he had information that could have saved lives and didn't act on it, what does that say about his judgment? What else has he ignored?" While Abbott's political stock was plummeting, Crockett's was soaring. The confrontation showcased exactly the kind of leadership that many Democrats had been hungry for, someone willing to challenge power with facts, hold leaders accountable for their failures, and speak for people who had been ignored by the political system. Within a week of the confrontation, Crockett had gained over 200,000 new followers across social media platforms. Her office was flooded with speaking requests from Democratic organizations across the country. Political commentators began mentioning her as a rising star who could potentially challenge Abbott in a future gubernatorial race. But Crockett herself remained focused on the substantive issues the confrontation had raised. In interviews following the event, she consistently brought the conversation back to the victims of Abbott's failures and the need for real accountability. "This isn't about me or my political career," she said on CNN. "This is about 246 people who died because their government failed them. This is about making sure that never happens again." The confrontation also highlighted broader questions about political accountability and media coverage. For years, Abbott had been able to avoid serious scrutiny of his record on the power grid, partly because the technical nature of energy policy made it difficult for non-experts to challenge his claims. Crockett's approach, using public documents, focusing on specific decisions, and connecting policy choices to real-world consequences, provided a template for how politicians could be held accountable for complex policy failures. Political scientists noted that the confrontation represented a new model for political accountability in the social media age. Rather than relying on traditional media to fact-check politicians or on formal investigations that take months or years, Crockett had demonstrated how public officials could be challenged in real time with publicly available information. As the weeks turned into months, it became clear that the confrontation had fundamentally altered Texas politics. Abbott, once considered a potential presidential candidate, was now focused on political survival. His agenda became more defensive, less ambitious, as he tried to rebuild his reputation. The incident also energized Democratic organizing efforts across Texas. Voter registration drives in Democratic-leaning areas saw significant increases, with many new registrants citing the confrontation as motivation to become more politically engaged. Republican strategists privately acknowledged that the confrontation had created a new template for challenging their candidates. No longer could they rely on friendly forums and softball questions to showcase their leaders. Any public appearance now carried the risk that someone like Crockett might show up with documents and hard questions. Perhaps most importantly, the confrontation brought renewed attention to the victims of Winter Storm Uri and their families. For 3 years, many of these families had felt forgotten, their losses treated as unavoidable tragedies rather than preventable failures. A memorial service held 6 months after the confrontation drew thousands of attendees, including many political leaders who had previously ignored the anniversary of the storm. Crockett spoke at the service, reading the names of all 246 victims and renewing her commitment to ensuring their deaths would not be forgotten. They deserve better from their government, she said. They deserved leaders who would act on warnings, who would prioritize their safety over political games, who would see their lives as more important than campaign contributions. We can't bring them back, but we can make sure their deaths mean something by demanding better from those who claim to serve us. In the end, the confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Greg Abbott represented more than just a political moment. It established a new standard for how politicians should be held accountable for their failures. The combination of thorough research, moral clarity, and fearless questioning created a template that will be replicated across the country. Other politicians began hiring staff specifically to research public documents and prepare for potential confrontations. Political forums became more careful about screening participants and questions. The era of politicians being able to make unchallenged claims about their records was effectively over. For Texas voters, the confrontation provided something they had been missing for years: clarity. No longer did they have to wonder whether Abbott was competent or whether his failures were unavoidable. They had seen him rendered speechless when confronted with his own documented negligence. The man who had built a career on projecting strength and competence had been exposed as someone who prioritized politics over people, even when lives hung in the balance. His face during those 30 seconds of silence said everything voters needed to know about who he really was and what he really valued. And Jasmine Crockett, the Congresswoman who had dared to speak truth to power, had shown that accountability was still possible in American politics. You just had to be willing to do the research, ask the hard questions, and refuse to accept excuses when people's lives were at stake. If this story of political accountability inspired you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We'll continue bringing you the moments when truth confronts power and the people's voices are finally heard. What do you think? Should more politicians be held accountable like this? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with anyone who believes in real political accountability. Abbott really is.